The seasons had turned once more, but this time, the wind that blew through the apple trees of Orchard House did not carry the sting of winter or the sorrow of loss. Instead, it was a warm, fragrant breeze that spoke of a bountiful harvest and the fulfillment of long-held dreams. The brown house, which had stood through the storms of war and the shadows of grief, now seemed to glow with a quiet, golden anticipation. It was a time of homecoming, not just of people, but of hearts that had wandered far and wide only to find that their truest compass always pointed back to the hearth where they had first learned the meaning of love. The silence of Beth's absence was still there, a soft, echoing chord in the background of their lives, but it was no longer a piercing cry. It had become a gentle, guiding harmony that encouraged them to cherish every moment of their togetherness. The most anticipated event of the season was the return of Laurie and Amy from their long European sojourn. 4 months, letters had traveled across the vast Atlantic, filled with Amy's elegant descriptions of Parisian salons and Laurie's thoughtful reflections on the ancient beauty of Rome. But the latest letters had carried a secret that had set the hearts of the March family aflutter with a joyous disbelief. The boy next door and the artistic child had found something in the light of the Mediterranean that they had never quite found in the snows of New England. A deep, resonant love that was built on the ruins of their former selves. They were returning not just as friends, but as husband and wife, having been quietly married in a small, sun-drenched chapel in Vevey, with only the mountains and the lake as witnesses to their vows. The day of their arrival was a masterpiece of autumn brilliance. The orchard was heavy with ripening fruit, red apples that looked like polished gems and pears that hung like golden bells from the weighted branches. Joe, Meg, and Marmee had spent the entire morning in a whirlwind of preparation. The kitchen was a battlefield of sweet aromas. The spicy scent of cinnamon, the earthy fragrance of baking bread, and the intoxicating sweetness of preserved plums. Jo, her hair more unruly than ever in her excitement, moved between the parlor and the porch, her gray eyes constantly scanning the road for the first sign of the Lawrence carriage. She felt a strange, beautiful peace in her soul, a happiness for Laurie that was entirely free from the bitterness of her past refusal. "They're coming. I see the dust by the stone wall," Jo shouted, her voice ringing out through the quiet afternoon like a joyful bell. The entire household spilled out onto the porch. Even Mr. March emerged from his study, his scholarly face illuminated by a broad, fatherly smile. The carriage rumbled up the path, and before the horses had even come to a full stop, a young man leaped out with the grace of a panther. It was Laurie, but a Laurie that Jo had never truly known. The restless, haunted look was gone, replaced by a steady, masculine poise and a radiance that seemed to come from within. He turned and reached into the carriage, helping out a woman who looked like a vision from a high-fashion plate, yet possessed the unmistakable warm glow of a March girl. Amy had become the lady that Aunt March had always envisioned, but she had retained the heart that Jo had always loved. She was dressed in a traveling suit of deep navy silk, her golden hair perfectly styled under a modest but elegant bonnet. As her feet touched the soil of her home, she didn't wait for a formal greeting. She ran into her mother's arms, her tears of joy mingling with the laughter of her sisters. The circle was being mended, thread by thread, and the loom of fate was producing a pattern of such vibrant beauty that it took their breath away. "Oh, Marmee, Jo, Meg," Amy sobbed, her face buried in the familiar scent of her mother's apron. "The world is so big and so beautiful, but there is no light like the light in this parlor. I've seen the masterpieces of the Louvre and the ruins of the Colosseum, but they are all cold stone compared to the warmth of this house." Laurie stood back for a moment, his eyes meeting Jo's in a long, silent look of mutual understanding and profound forgiveness. He stepped forward and took her hands, his grip firm and grounding. "I've brought her back, Jo. I've brought the best of the world home to you. I hope you can love your new brother as much as you loved your old Teddy." Jo felt a sob of pure, unadulterated happiness rise in her throat. She pulled him into a fierce embrace, her jagged hair brushing against his velvet coat. "I love you more, Laurie, because now you are truly yourself, and you've found the person who can make you the man you were always meant to be. Welcome home, my brother. The orchard has missed its king." The evening that followed was a feast of the soul. They gathered around the long dining table, the empty chair at the end draped with a garland of autumn leaves, a silent, loving place for Beth. Laurie told stories of their travels, of the narrow streets of Florence and the grand concerts of Vienna, while Amy shared her sketches and the treasures she had collected. But the greatest treasure was the way they looked at each other, a quiet, constant communication of respect and devotion that filled the room with a new kind of music. John Brooke and Meg sat together, their young twins playing at their feet, a living testament to the domestic happiness that had once seemed so far away. Professor Bhaer was there too, having become a frequent and beloved guest at Orchard House. He sat next to Joe, his deep, resonant laughter joining the chorus of voices, his presence providing a steady, intellectual anchor to the exuberant joy of the reunion. Joe looked around the table and realized that her great refusal had been the seed that had allowed this magnificent harvest to grow. If she had said yes to Laurie out of duty or fear, this night of pure, authentic happiness would never have happened. As the moon rose over the orchard, casting a silver, celestial light over the house, the group moved to the porch to watch the stars. The air was cool, but the warmth of their shared love was a shield against the coming winter. They talked of the future, of the school that Joe and Friedrich dreamed of building, of the art that Amy would continue to create, and of the lives they would lead as adults in a world that was no longer a battlefield but a garden. "We are no longer the little pilgrims," Meg said softly, her hand resting on her husband's arm. "We have reached the high ground, and the view is more beautiful than I ever imagined." "The journey never truly ends," Mr. March added, his voice a steady rumble in the dark. "But the resting places become more sweet when they are shared with those who have walked the road with us. You have done well, my little women. You have turned the thorns of your youth into the fruit of your maturity." Joe looked at the dark shape of the Lawrence mansion next door and then back at the glowing windows of Orchard House. She felt a profound sense of completion. The harvest time had arrived and the fruit was sweet, ripe, and abundant. She reached for Friedrich's hand under the cover of the shadows, her fingers finding his with a certainty that was as solid as the earth. The pilgrimage was continuing, the horizon was still there, but the fear was gone. They were the March family, scarred, changed, and diminished by loss, yet expanded by love and strengthened by truth. As the first frost of autumn began to sparkle on the grass, they stood together, a circle of light in a vast, waiting world, ready for the next chapter of a story that would never truly end. The golden autumn of reunions was followed by a winter of quiet reflection, and as the new year dawned, a significant change occurred that would alter the course of Joe March's life forever. Aunt March, the formidable, sharp-tongued matriarch who had been both a thorn and a benefactor to the family, passed away in her sleep as peacefully as a fading shadow. She left behind a legacy of rigid rules and ironclad opinions, but she also left something that no one expected: her vast, sprawling estate of Plumfield. To the shock of the entire town and the tearful gratitude of the March family, the grand mansion was bequeathed to Joe, the very niece who had challenged her the most, the wild falcon, who had refused to be tamed. When Joe first walked through the heavy oak doors of Plumfield as its mistress, the air inside felt cold and thick with the dust of decades. The long hallways were lined with grim portraits and covered furniture, echoing with the silence of a life that had been lived with more discipline than joy. But as Joe looked at the wide, sun-drenched meadows that stretched out from the back porch and the sturdy old-fashioned barns that sat under the sheltering elms, she didn't see a lonely mansion. She saw a laboratory of the soul. She saw a place where the restless energy of boys could be channeled into character, where the wildness she had once possessed could be nurtured into strength, and where the lessons of Orchard House could be shared with a new generation of pilgrims. "It's too big for just a home, Friedrich," Joe said, her eyes shining with a visionary fire as she stood in the center of the great hall with Professor Bhaer. "It's a world. It's a place for all the little men who have no one to believe in them. I want to turn Plumfield into a school, not a school of rote learning and cold examinations but a school of life. I want to teach them to be brave, to be honest, and to find their own celestial city through work and love." Professor Bhaer took her hands, his scholarly face illuminated by a profound, reverent pride. "It is the dream we spoke of in New York, Joe. The bread of the soul. You have the heart of a mother and the mind of a philosopher. There is no better combination for a teacher. We shall open the doors and we shall let the sun shine in, both the sun of the sky and the sun of truth." The transformation of Plumfield was a labor of love that involved the entire family. Laurie and Amy, now settled into their own home but always present at Joe's side, provided the means to turn the drafty old house into a warm, vibrant sanctuary. Meg came with her experience of the Dovecot to help arrange the kitchens and the dormitories, her practical wisdom ensuring that the school was a place of order as well as inspiration. Marmee and Father moved into a quiet wing of the house, their presence providing the spiritual foundation for the new enterprise. The first few students arrived like a collection of ragged, stray birds seeking shelter from a storm. There was Nat, a thin, frightened orphan with a soul for music that reminded Joe so much of Beth that it brought tears to her eyes. There was Dan, a wild, defiant boy with eyes like a trapped animal, whose spirit was as unruly as Joe's had ever been. There were boys from wealthy families who needed discipline, and boys from the streets who needed a father's hand and a mother's heart. Plumfield was unlike any school the town of Concord had ever seen. There were no uniforms, no corporal punishment, and no rigid schedules that stifled the imagination. Instead, there were gardens for each boy to tend, animals to care for, and long rambles through the woods where lessons in botany and history were learned from the earth itself. Jo was the mother bear, a whirlwind of energy who could climb a tree with the best of them, settle a dispute with a fair and firm hand, and tuck a dozen boys into bed with a story that stayed in their hearts long after the lamps were extinguished. Professor Bhaer was the father bear, the quiet intellectual anchor who taught them languages through songs and philosophy through the simple acts of daily life. He showed them that true strength was found in kindness, and that the greatest victory was the conquest of one's own temper. Together, they created a world where the little men could grow into the pillars of the future, anchored by the same values that had sustained the little women during the dark days of the war. The house, once so silent and grim, was now filled with a magnificent, chaotic symphony of life. There was the sound of racing feet in the hallways, the joyous barking of dogs in the yard, and the sweet, hesitant notes of Nat's violin drifting from the music room. The harvest time was no longer just about the fruit in the orchard. It was about the harvest of character that was being reaped in the hearts of these boys. Jo found a fulfillment in Plumfield that her pen had never quite been able to provide. She realized that while stories on paper were beautiful, stories lived in human lives were immortal. She still wrote in the quiet hours of the night. The manuscript of Little Women was finally nearing its completion, but her greatest work was being written in the smiles of the boys who had found a home in her house. One evening, as the sun set over the meadows, painting the tall grass in strokes of amber and gold, Jo stood on the porch and looked out at her kingdom. She saw Laurie and Dan working together in the garden, the man teaching the boy the patience of the soil. She saw Amy and Nat at the piano in the distance, the artist encouraging the musician. She saw the lights being lit in the windows of Plumfield, each one a beacon of hope in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. She felt a soft touch on her shoulder and turned to find Marmee standing beside her. "You've done it, Jo," Marmee whispered, her eyes reflecting the silver light of the rising moon. "You've taken Aunt March's thorns and turned them into roses. You've built a house that is large enough to hold all the love you were given." "It's not my work alone, Marmee," Jo replied, leaning her head against her mother's shoulder. "It's all of us. It's the legacy of Orchard House and the Dovecot, and even the seaside cottage. Plumfield is just the place where all our paths have finally come together. We are no longer the little pilgrims seeking the city. We have built the city here in the middle of these fields." The loom of fate had woven a pattern of such complexity and beauty that Jo could only marvel at the design. The refusal of Laurie had led to the arrival of Friedrich. The loss of Beth had led to the saving of boys like Nat, and the poverty of their youth had led to the abundance of their maturity. As the stars began to twinkle over the elms, Jo March felt a quiet, profound peace. The pilgrimage was not over, for a teacher's journey never truly ends, but the resting place was sweet, and the fruit of her toil was the most beautiful harvest she could have ever imagined. The little women had become the keepers of the gate, and as the lights of Plumfield glowed in the dark, they stood as a testament to the power of a family that had learned to turn every shadow into a new and more brilliant dawn. The establishment of Plumfield had brought a new chaotic rhythm to Jo March's life, but amidst the demands of mothering a dozen rambunctious boys and managing a grand estate, the ink pot on her desk never ran dry. 4 months, in the late night hours when the house finally settled into a deep, rhythmic slumber, Jo had been pouring her soul onto the pages of a manuscript that was unlike anything she had ever attempted before. It wasn't a sensational tale of masked villains or desperate duels. It was a quiet, domestic chronicle. It was the story of the Brown house, the 4 sisters, the trials of poverty, the beauty of sacrifice, and the haunting melody of a life lost too soon. She titled it Little Women, and as she wrote the final words she felt a profound sense of release, as if she had finally found a way to keep Beth's light burning forever in a world that so desperately needed its warmth. The journey from the attic desk to the publisher's office was fraught with a familiar, nervous dread. Jo remembered the days of New York, the rejections, and the compromises she had made just to pay the rent. But this time she had an advocate in Friedrich Bhaer, whose faith in her authentic voice was a shield against her own self-doubt. When the heavy package was sent off to the city, Jo felt as if she had sent a part of her own heart into the cold, clinical world of commerce. She didn't expect fame, she didn't even expect fortune. She simply wanted to tell the truth about the women she knew and the love that had sustained them. The response from the publisher arrived on a rainy afternoon that smelled of wet earth and early lilacs. It wasn't a polite rejection or a request for more thrills. It was a letter of stunned, reverent praise. The editor wrote of how the story had moved him to tears, how the characters felt like his own sisters, and how the simplicity of the narrative possessed a power that far surpassed the loudest melodrama. They wanted to publish it immediately, and they were offering a sum of money that made Jo's eyes widen in disbelief. A sum that could secure the future of Plumfield and provide for her parents' old age in a way she had only dreamed of in her most ambitious moments. The publication of Little Women was like the opening of a dam. The book didn't just sell, it resonated. In the parlors of Boston, the cottages of the frontier, and even across the ocean in the grand houses of London, people were reading the story of the March sisters. They laughed at Jo's blunders, wept at Beth's passing, and cheered for Meg's domestic happiness. Jo received letters from strangers who felt as if they knew her, girls who saw themselves in her restlessness, and mothers who found comfort in Marmee's wisdom. The Wild Falcon had become a voice for an entire generation, proving that the most personal stories are often the most universal. But the true triumph for Jo wasn't the fame or the financial security, it was the scene in the parlor of Orchard House when the first finished copy arrived. She had requested a special binding, a deep, soft crimson silk that reminded her of the guidebooks they had carried as children. She sat on the rug at Marmee's feet, just as she had done 1,000 times before, and placed the book in her mother's lap. "It's for us, Marmee," Jo whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's for the girls we were and the women we've become. And it's for Beth. I wanted to make sure she was never forgotten, even by people who never met her." Marmee touched the gold-embossed letters on the cover with a trembling hand, her eyes filling with a pride that was too deep for words. Father sat in his armchair, his scholarly glasses perched on his nose, reading the first few pages with a nod of profound approval. Even Laurie and Amy came over from the mansion, their faces radiant with a shared joy. To see their lives transformed into a masterpiece of literature was a strange, beautiful experience. A way of seeing the divine design in the everyday struggles they had endured. "You've done it, Jo," Laurie said, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You've turned our old games into a legend. Every time someone reads this book, we'll be back in that attic together, playing our plays and dreaming our dreams. You've given us a kind of immortality." The success of the book brought a new prosperity to the entire March Circle, but it didn't change the essence of who they were. Jo used the royalties to expand Plumfield, building a new wing for a library and a music room where Nat could study the violin with the best masters. She bought a comfortable carriage for her parents and ensured that Meg's children would have every educational advantage. But she herself remained the same Jo, unpretentious, a bit clumsy, and fiercely dedicated to her boys and her family. Success also brought a new kind of pressure. The public wanted more. They wanted to know what happened next, they wanted to know if Jo ever got married, and they wanted to know if there were more sisters to meet. Jo found herself in the strange position of being a celebrity, but she navigated it with a wit and a directness that charmed everyone she met. She realized that her pen was a tool for good, a way to influence the world without ever having to leave the sheltering elms of Plumfield. One evening, Jo sat on the porch of the grand house, watching the first fireflies of summer dance over the meadows. Professor Bhaer sat beside her, a copy of her book in his hand. He looked at the dedication page which simply read, "To the cricket by the hearth." "It is a beautiful thing you have done, Friedrich," Jo said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But I realized something today. The book is just a reflection. The real story is here, in these boys, in this house, and in the way we love each other. I'm glad the world likes the book, but I'm more glad that I have the life that inspired it." "The book is the fruit, Jo, but the life is the tree," the professor replied, his voice a warm, grounding rumble. "You have reaped a magnificent harvest because you were brave enough to plant the seeds of truth in the middle of your own sorrow. The world hears you because you spoke from the heart, and the heart is the only thing that never grows old." As the moon rose over Plumfield, casting its silver, celestial light over the sprawling meadows and the sleeping boys, Jo March felt a quiet, profound sense of gratitude. She had reached a horizon she had never even dared to imagine. She was a wife, a mother to the motherless, a provider for her family, and a voice that had touched the soul of a nation. The pilgrimage was continuing, the road stretched out toward the unknown future, but she walked it with a steady step and a joyful heart. The harvest time had brought forth a bounty that was far greater than she had ever hoped for, and as she looked up at the stars, she knew that somewhere, in a city where there are no shadows, a quiet girl was smiling at the music her sister had made out of the silence. The relentless wheel of time had spun through many more seasons since the first opening of Plumfield's gates, and the world outside the sheltering elms of Concord had changed in ways the March sisters could never have imagined. Generations had come and gone, fashions had shifted, and the echoes of the Great War were now silent whispers in the history books. But inside the heart of the March family, the core of their spirit remained as steadfast and radiant as the first morning they had decided to be pilgrims. The orchard had grown older, its trunks gnarled and silvered by the years, but its fruit was sweeter than ever, a living symbol of the life that had been cultivated with so much patience, so much sorrow, and so much love. The occasion was Marmee's 60th birthday, a milestone that brought the entire sprawling clan back to the hearth of Orchard House for a grand harvest festival. It was a day that seemed to have been painted by the hand of an old master. The sky was a deep, translucent sapphire, the air was crisp with the scent of wood smoke and ripening grapes, and the golden sunlight slanted through the trees in long ethereal beams. The house was once again a hive of activity, but it was a different kind of energy now. There were no longer just four voices. There was a symphony of grandchildren, young students from Plumfield, and old friends who had walked the long road together. Meg, now a grandmother herself, moved with a quiet, maternal grace that had become her defining trait. She presided over the long tables in the garden, her face a map of a life lived well in the service of a simple, profound domesticity. Her John was beside her, his hair white but his eyes still full of the same devotion that had won her heart in the parlor all those years ago. The dovecot had grown, adding rooms as the family expanded, but it remained a sanctuary of peace, a testament to the fact that a small life can be a very grand thing indeed. Amy and Laurie arrived from the mansion, bringing with them a sense of elegance that had never lost its warmth. Amy had become a patron of the arts, her own talent having found its expression in the beauty she brought into the lives of everyone around her. Their daughter, little Beth, named in a gesture of eternal remembrance, ran through the orchard, her laughter a bright, silver echo of the girl who had once played there with her dolls. Laurie, now a man of substance and influence, looked at his wife and his family with a look of such deep, settled contentment that it was hard to remember the restless, unhappy boy he had once been. And then there was Jo, the mother Bhaer of Plumfield, the celebrated author and the fierce, loving center of the family. Her chestnut hair was now shot through with streaks of silver, but the fire in her gray eyes was undimmed. She stood on the porch of the old brown house, watching the scene before her with a heart that felt almost too large for her breast. Beside her stood Friedrich, his hand resting on her shoulder, his presence a constant, grounding warmth. They had seen hundreds of boys pass through the halls of Plumfield, each one a thread they had helped to weave into the fabric of a better world. The festival was a riot of color and sound. There were races for the boys, music performed by Nat, who was now a celebrated violinist, and a feast that celebrated the literal and metaphorical harvest of their lives. But as the afternoon faded into the long golden shadows of the evening, a hush fell over the group. It was the moment they all waited for, the time when they would gather under the great apple tree for the birthday tribute to Marmee. Marmee sat in the center of the circle, her face radiant with a beauty that time could not touch. She looked at her daughters, her sons-in-law, and the rows of grandchildren who sat on the grass at her feet. She saw the fruit of her toil, the result of the lessons she had taught in the dark hours of poverty and the bright hours of prosperity. "I have no words to tell you how my heart feels today," Marmee said, her voice steady and sweet as it reached every ear in the quiet garden. "I look at you all and I see the answer to every prayer I ever offered. We have been through the valley, we have seen the shadows, and we have lost those we loved. But we have never lost our way because we walked it together. My life has been a long pilgrimage, and this garden is my celestial city." Jo stepped forward, holding a small leather-bound volume in her hands. It was the newest edition of her work, but it was more than just a book. It was a record of their collective soul. "We are the ones who should thank you, Marmee," Jo said, her voice thick with a profound daughterly love. "You taught us to be little women, when the world wanted us to be small. You taught us that the greatest strength is kindness, and the greatest wealth is a heart that knows how to give. Everything we are, and everything we have built at Plumfield and the Dovecot, is because of the light you lit in that parlor when we were just children with burdens on our backs." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of violet, crimson, and deep, celestial gold, the family began to sing. It wasn't a song of mourning but a hymn of triumph, the same hymns they had sung with Beth, the same tunes that had echoed through the house during the war. The music drifted out over the orchard, across the fence to the Lawrence mansion, and up into the vast, starry night. In that moment, Jo felt a presence beside her that she hadn't felt in years. It was a lightness in the air, a soft vibration in the music, a sense of a quiet girl with dark eyes smiling from the shadows of the apple trees. She realized that the circle was never truly broken. Beth was there, in the laughter of the children and the peace of the evening. They were all there, the girls they had been and the women they had become, woven into a single immortal pattern of love. Oh, my girls, however long you may live, I never can wish you a greater happiness than this. Marmee exclaimed, her arms reaching out to encircle them all. The harvest festival drew to a close as the first stars began to twinkle over Concord. One by one the lamps were lit in Orchard House, casting warm rectangular glows onto the grass. The guests began to depart, the sounds of carriages and farewells fading into the night. Jo stayed on the porch for a final moment, looking out at the dark orchard. She felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the road she had walked, for the poverty that had made her strong, for the love that had made her wise, and even for the sorrow that had made her human. The pilgrimage was not over, for life is a journey that continues beyond the horizon. But as Jo March turned to go inside, to the warmth of the fire and the arms of her Friedrich, she knew that she had reached the highest ground. The little women had finished their story, but the music they had made would resonate through the ages, a beacon of hope for every pilgrim who ever dared to dream of a home built on truth and a heart anchored in love. The door of Orchard House closed softly, but the light in the windows remained, a steady golden flame in the middle of the vast, waiting dark. The harvest was in, the fruit was gathered, and the world was a little more beautiful because four sisters had once decided to play at being pilgrims in the attic of a small brown house. And in the silence of the night, the apple trees whispered their final blessing over the house where love had truly found its home.